How slow can you push your shutter speed to still make sharp action photos? I'm talking about why you shouldn't be afraid of going slow, all on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you should know what to do by now. You just go to askdavidbergman.com, submit that form on the site, and I just might pick your question and answer right here on a future show. This week's question actually comes from a comment on a photo that I posted on my Instagram, which, by the way, is at David Bergman, if you want to follow me there. It was a photo of Luke Combs in concert, and in my post, I said that I was at 1/400th of a second shutter speed. I thought that a comment from John L. would make for a really good show topic, so I reached out to him and he said it was okay to use his name. What he said was, 1/400th? Super helpful to know how slow you can push in concert action. Epic shot, by the way. I do appreciate that, John. Thanks so much for saying that, and thanks for letting me use your comment here on the show. So what I'm going to do today is talk about shutter speeds, why you might want to slow things down, and how slow you can actually go while still making great images. Now, as you probably know, your shutter speed controls how long light is captured by your camera's digital sensor, or on the film if you're so inclined. And it doesn't matter if you're using a mechanical shutter or an electronic shutter, it's basically the same exact thing. We're going to measure this in fractions of a second, where higher numbers mean faster shutter speeds. So 1/500th of a second is much faster than 1/4 of a second. Now, shutter speed impacts two key things: exposure and motion. The faster your shutter speed, the less light enters your camera, making your images darker. And because faster shutter speeds are capturing a shorter amount of time, it gives you a better shot at freezing movement. The challenge is that those two things can be in opposition to each other. You might be in a dark environment where you've opened up your aperture as wide as your lens will go, and you've pushed your ISO up as high as you're comfortable. And your picture might still be too dark. So what do? At that point, the only way to brighten up your image is to slow down your shutter speed. But you do run the risk of getting motion blur if you go too slow. So how do you deal with this all too common situation? Well, the first thing to figure out is how slow you can go and still freeze the motion that you want. And that depends on what you're shooting. If it's just me, slowly moving back and forth like this, I'd bet that 125th of a second would be enough. For sports action like soccer, I'd want to get it at least 800 or 1,000th of a second to freeze that action. If you're shooting something crazy fast, like a race car, 2,000th of a second or more. Now, those aren't hard or fast rules. You're going to need to experiment in your particular situation, but the idea is to get a shutter speed that's faster than you think you'll need. Unfortunately, sometimes you just don't have that luxury. So let's talk about what you can do with the slower shutter speeds. Now, first of all, you need to realize that what really matters is how quickly something changes in the image. If a person was running full speed across the frame like this, you're going to need a pretty fast shutter to capture them without any motion blur. They're never really in one spot for very long. But sometimes, even with fast action, there are peak moments where your subject isn't really moving that fast. During a jump, for example, they're moving on the way up and on the way down. I made this photo of Bon Jovi at only 320th of a second, and there's no motion blur. At the very top, when he hits that apex, there's a very short moment where he's not moving much at all. That's the picture that I want to capture. Now, another factor to consider is how big is the subject in your frame. If they're really small, you might have some blur, but really can't see it. When I'm on tour, I always like to go to the top of each venue and make a big wide shot showing the whole crowd. I usually want to expose for the crowd, which means a slow shutter speed. This is at 1/50th of a second, and no one can tell if any of the 70,000 people are moving or not. Now, I still do want it to be sharp in case I ever make a big print of the photo, so I'll do everything I can to stabilize myself when I'm shooting, as well as the camera, as much as I possibly can. I might lean against a wall, I'm going to hold my arms in tight to my body and use the viewfinder up against my face instead of holding the camera out in front of me. It's going to be much more stable that way. I'm also going to shoot with the electronic shutter if possible to minimize camera shake, and of course I'm going to use image stabilization if my camera or lens has it. Now, that all is going to help to counter the movement of my body. If I safely can put my camera down on something like a railing, even better. But then I'm going to shoot as many long bursts of images as possible, and I'm virtually guaranteed to get a good shot or two. Also, keep in mind that some parts of your image are moving faster than others. For this shot of Luke Combs, I was using my Canon RF 100 to 500 millimeter lens, and my shutter was at 1/60th of a second. That's pretty slow, but his face is tack sharp because he's not moving that much. However, if you look at his hand that's strumming the guitar, there certainly is motion there. The question is, does it matter at all? I submit that it does not, at least not in this case. When you back up and look at the entire frame, you really don't notice that slight motion blur. So I know that I can slow down my shutter speed if I have to and still make a dynamic action photo. So what else can you do if you absolutely have to use a slow shutter speed? If it's possible and appropriate, I say you can add flash. Something I do quite often is called dragging the shutter. It allows me to use a slow shutter speed to bring in enough ambient light in the background, but the fast flash duration is still going to freeze my subject. Flash usually isn't allowed at a concert, but I do carry one around for occasional photos of the crowd. For this shot of my friends Lauren and Ashley at a Luke show, I wanted to see the fans and stage in the background, so I went with a 50th of a second shutter speed. By adding in the Canon speed light I had on top of my camera, it freezes the expression on their faces, even though they're moving pretty quickly. There's still some motion around them, which just adds to the energy of the movement. It can be a bit tricky to find the right balance of ambient light to flash, but it works best if you start with a background that's brighter than your subject. Now, there are times when you might actually want to go slow for creative reasons. For example, there's a trick you can do when shooting in rain or snow to accentuate the effect of the weather. Even if it's coming down super hard, when you shoot with a fast shutter speed like 500th of a second or more, rain looks like tiny little droplets. The shutter speed freezes them in motion, so all you see are some little dots. But by shooting with a longer shutter speed like a 50th of a second, you capture more of the motion of each falling drop, and it looks really cool, especially if you're backlit against a dark background. You do need to stay as still as possible, and like I've said before, shoot a bunch of long bursts and try to get a moment when your subject isn't moving that much. All you need is one cool frame, and you've created something unique. Other times, you might want to slow down the shutter to make panning shots. You do that by moving your camera with your subject to try and keep them in the exact same spot in the frame. But because your shutter speed is slow, the background might look like it's flying by. I did a video a bunch of years ago with tips and tricks for making good panning shots. I'll put a link to that down below in the description. Now, you might also decide, either for creative reasons or simply because you have no other choice, that you just want to use a slow shutter speed and accept that motion blur. There is something kind of ethereal in images that you would never see with the naked eye. Lean into it and try to make art whenever you can. Now, beyond action photography, you can use slow shutter speeds to capture things like fireworks or even the night sky. When I photographed Niagara Falls, I did it first with a fast shutter speed, which freezes the falling water. Then I put the camera on a tripod and used a 2-second shutter to make the water look silky smooth. It's a pretty cool effect. So as you can see, John L., you can still make great images, even concert action photos, using slow shutter speeds. Here's my challenge to all of you out there on the interwebs. Take a moving subject and shoot it at different shutter speeds. Start fast and then gradually slow it down. If you don't want to deal with manual exposure, use shutter priority and let the camera adjust your aperture and your ISO. Eventually, add in flash if you want, and then look at how the motion and light interact in each frame and experiment with how you can use those changes creatively. It's really going to help you to conquer any situation, no matter what shutter speed you're using. Let me know how it goes down in the comments below. Remember, you can always send in your own photography questions at askdavidbergman.com. If you like this video, I do appreciate you hitting that like button. Subscribe to the Adorama YouTube channel. Don't forget to click that little bell icon. You'll be notified when new videos come out from myself and all the other photo hosts on Adorama TV. Thanks so much for watching. I do appreciate it. I'll see you back here next time right here on Ask David Bergman.